Hello and welcome everyone to this podcast for cell biology. In this podcast we're going to focus on the light reactions of photosynthesis. Sometimes we will call this stage 1. I wanted to remind you with this figure from your textbook that the light reactions, which we're going to talk about in this podcast, how they're linked to the Calvin cycle. In the next podcast we'll talk about the Calvin cycle. But remember that it's the sun that comes down and starts the whole process. We'll see in a moment how the sun, the photons from the sun, will interact with these things we call photosystems. In fact, we'll talk about Photosystems I and II. There's two of them we'll talk about. And how these photosystems produce ATP and NADPH. And that these photosystems, in producing these two products, ATP and NADPH, are used by the Calvin cycle. They then produce NADP plus and ADP, which are then again used by the light capturing reactions to continue the process. We will also see how the light capturing reactions produce oxygen, and in the next podcast we'll see how using ATP and NADPH the Calvin cycle makes sugars. But let's go ahead and start talking about photosystems in a general sense, and then we'll explain how they work in Photosystems I and II. But keep in mind, these photosystems are the reactions that we collectively call the light capturing reactions. The ability to capture light energy and convert it to chemical energy requires what is known as a photosystem. So photosystems in general, they capture light energy and convert it into chemical energy. Okay, so here's our thylakoid membrane. And within the thylakoid membrane is where the photosystems are located. Now these photosystems contain two main kinds of complexes. The first are the antenna complexes. The antenna complexes contain lots of chlorophylls. All these chlorophylls in here take advantage of the photons that come in here to destabilize them. You'll have different chlorophylls at different energy levels within an antenna complex. And they can be adjacent to each other, as I'm showing here. By having them so close to each other, when they want to transfer energy to their neighbors, it's easier to do that. And so why is it transferring energy? Well, remember, we said we have our very good friend here, the sun. It's shooting down photons here. And when it hits a chlorophyll molecule, remember, it excites it to a higher energy. And remember that higher energy makes it very unstable. And it wants to release some of that energy so it can become stable again. And it does so by passing it on to chlorophylls that have a lower energy. It can do it within a antenna complex, or it can do it between neighboring complexes. But the goal is to move that unstable energy, that high energy, from a chlorophyll molecule with higher energy, less stability, to one that has lower energy. And by moving it to one with lower energy, you reduce some of that overall instability. Which brings us to our next complex. And our next complex, I'm going to show here, is called the reaction center. Within the reaction center, so within the reaction center, there are these two special chlorophylls. And your book calls these chlorophyll special pair. So they're a unique pair of chlorophyll molecules. And what makes them unique is that of all the chlorophylls that we've seen so far, these are at the lowest energy. This is where that energy, this unstable energy from the antenna complex, ultimately will move to. And at this point here, there are no other chlorophylls for it to transfer because we're at the lowest pair. So now what does it do with that energy here? It still wants to get rid of it. In fact, it has to get rid of it. So what's it going to do with that energy, those electrons? It's going to move those electrons to this special carrier. This is an electron carrier. As it does this movement, this is going to become negative, and up here, this special pair of chlorophylls will become positive. Now before I go to a new board here, I want to keep this picture here because there's something I want to come back to in just a moment. So I want to mention something down here in the corner. So let me box this off here. And I want to remind you that photosynthetic organisms' goal, or one of their main goals, is to build organic molecules like sugars. To accomplish this, the plants are going to need lots of energy, and they're going to need lots of reducing power. They get this energy in the form of ATP that they're going to have to generate, and the reducing power they get in the form of NADPH. In order to make both ATP and NADPH, they're going to require two photosystems. This part's going to be the same regardless. How the electrons are excited, how they're transferred to this special pair of chlorophyll molecules, and then how they're passed to this carrier. Now what's going to change between one photosystem to the next is the type of electron carrier here and what the end product will be. So we're going to talk about two photosystems next. The one that makes ATP, which is the first one, is called Photosystem II. And the one that comes after that, the one that makes NADPH, is called Photosystem I. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin talking about Photosystem II. And remember, Photosystem II is going to be responsible for making ATP. So remember, just as a point of reference, this is our cell here with our thylakoid membranes, like so. Our photosystems are going to be located in these membranes that I drew on the previous whiteboard. They're going to be all across this membrane. So now that we have our frame of reference, let's draw our thylakoid membrane here so we can talk about specifically Photosystem II. The way I've drawn it, the thylakoid lumen is up here and the stroma is below here. So stroma's out here. And up here, this area here is inside of the lumen of the thylakoid. So the photosystem II that we want to describe will look very similar to what we saw on the last whiteboard, where we have our antenna complex. And again, you could have several of these, but I'm just drawing one. And it's going to be partnered up with a reaction center, RC for reaction center. And then we have this electron carrier. And more specifically, this electron carrier is going to be called plastoquinone. And remember, I said that photosystem II is going to make ATP, so in this entire photosystem II complex here, we're going to need to have an ATPase, much like we saw in the mitochondria. And just like we saw in the mitochondria, we will need to have a high concentration of protons in the lumen so that they can be fed through here to make ATP. So how do we get a high concentration of protons in the lumen so that we can make ATP, which is a requirement for photosystem II? Well, we're going to start, as usual here, with our friend the sun. And it's going to send photons down. And these photons, just like we saw in the last slide, are going to interact with chlorophyll molecules. And just like we said on the last slide, these photons will excite a high energy electron in a chlorophyll, and then that energy, not the electron, but the energy is passed from one chlorophyll molecule to the next chlorophyll molecule that has a lower energy state. Now remember, at some point the energy gets transferred to the chlorophyll with the lowest energy state in the antenna complex. And so it finally gets transferred to this final special pair of chlorophylls in the reaction center that have even a lower energy state. And so they're able to transfer that energy from this last chlorophyll molecule in the antenna complex to the special pair of chlorophyll molecules in the reaction center. That creates reactive electron in the chlorophyll molecules in the reactive center. And it can't transfer it back to another chlorophyll because there's nothing lower. And so remember what we said, instead of transferring energy this time, we're going to transfer the actual electron. And this electron gets transferred to this electron carrier, but in photosystem II, that electron carrier is specifically called plastoquinone. Now, just similar as we saw with electron transport, this plastoquinone will move these electrons to this other complex that we haven't talked about yet. This other complex is called cytochrome complex. In delivering the electrons to the cytochrome complex, it releases the electrons to this complex, and in that process delivers protons from the stroma into the thylakoid lumen. Since during daylight there is a fairly constant supply of sun coming down, this will result in a very high yield of protons being transported across the membrane. Not to mention that within that membrane of the thylakoid, these photosystem II proteins are highly abundant. So it's not just one of them, it's a lot of them. So you get a lot of protons in this lumen. Now once you have protons in this lumen, just like we saw with electron transport, these protons can now be pumped through ATPase in a similar manner to produce ATP, and it will produce quite a bit of ATP. And now this ATP will be taken into the next photosynthesis stage, that is the Calvin cycle, which we'll talk about later. So what I want to talk about next is Photosystem I. Okay, so let's talk about Photosystem I now. And remember, Photosystem I, the reason it's important for plant cells is that it's going to produce this NADPH molecule. Okay, we're going to show the same membrane, thylakoid membrane. We still have our thylakoid lumen up here inside of the thylakoid, and down here we still have our stroma. Now Photosystem I is similar in the respect that, now Photosystem I is similar to Photosystem II in that it also has an antenna complex and a reaction center. RC for reaction center, AC for antenna complex. It's still going to receive photons from our sun, and just like we've talked about many times already, is that it's going to transfer energy from one chlorophyll molecule to another, and ultimately that energy will be transferred, if you remember, to the special pair of chlorophyll molecules. Now, unlike Photosystem II, these electrons that are in this reactive center, these special pair of chlorophylls, are not transferred to an electron carrier in the membrane. It's transferred to an electron carrier on the outside of the membrane on the stroma side. And this carrier is called ferredoxin. So once those electrons have been transferred to ferredoxin, ferredoxin will then take these electrons to this protein complex here called NADP plus reductase. And what that will do, these electrons, as they get moved over to this NADP plus reductase, it will convert NADP plus to NADPH. Just like Photosystem II produced ATP, Photosystem I now produces NADPH in the stroma, which with ATP will go on to help the Calvin cycle. Okay, so we just got done talking about the photosystems in the light reactions and how they generated ATP and NADPH for the Calvin cycle. But there are two things we haven't talked about. Well, I guess really three things. We haven't really addressed how water is involved in the light capturing reactions and how oxygen is produced. And in addition to the water and the oxygen problem we haven't talked about, there's also a problem in the reaction center that we need to address. So remember, there are three things we want to talk about. First is, how is water used? Because we said in the photosynthetic equation that water was important. We want to talk about how oxygen is made, because that is a product of photosynthesis, and we said it was the product of the light reactions. And this last thing I want to talk about is how are the special pair of chlorophyll regenerated. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So I'm going to first address Photosystem II. And I want to draw our trusty antenna complex here and our reaction center here. And then I want to remind you that in this reaction center we had this special pair of chlorophyll. And also in the antenna center we had lots of chlorophylls. And remember, we transferred energy from one to the other, and then ultimately we transferred that energy to this special pair. And as we've mentioned before, the instability of the chlorophylls here cannot transfer that energy. Instead, they have to transfer the electrons to some kind of electron carrier, and we've talked about a couple of those in our discussions. What you might have been thinking about is, if this special pair of chlorophylls is losing this reactive electron to this electron carrier, that leaves these chlorophyll molecules here, this special pair of chlorophyll molecules, it leaves them one electron short. If that continues and isn't regenerated, it will never be able to receive that energy again from the antenna complex. So we have to restore that electron in order to keep photosynthesis moving forward. And we're going to do this using water. So 2 water molecules are involved, as well as an enzyme that has a very convenient name, or at least the name I'm going to use. It's called a water splitting enzyme. So water will come along here, and using this water splitting enzyme, it will donate an electron from the water to each of these chlorophyll molecules, this special pair of chlorophyll molecules in the reaction center. As a result of donating those electrons, oxygen is produced and then taken out of the chloroplast. By doing this, we've restored the electrons in these chlorophyll molecules, so now they can be once again excited by the chlorophyll molecules in the antenna complex. And those electrons, once re-excited here in the reaction center, can be transferred and allow photosynthesis to continue. But it's really important to keep this water moving through this water splitting enzyme, producing oxygen to keep photosynthesis moving forward. Without this enzyme, photosynthesis would stop right there. Now I want to spend just a little time talking about Photosystem I. So if you look over here at our checklist, we've dealt with how water is used, and we dealt with how oxygen is made, and we dealt with how the special pair of chlorophylls are regenerated in PS2, but not in PS1. So I want to take you back here to Photosystem II. And if you remember, we said that this electron that was transferred to this electron carrier, and remember, just so you can keep notes proper here, this was called plastoquinone. And we've already discussed this one. This plastoquinone transfers this electron to this cytochrome complex that we've already talked about. And when I talked about this before, all I said was that the electron came here and moved through. Because at that point, I was really trying to stress the idea that that process was occurring to push protons through this cytochrome complex. But now I want to come back to these electrons that were transferred to here. So what happens to these electrons? Well, to make a long story short, what happens is those electrons are transferred to another enzyme. Don't worry about the name of this enzyme. They're transferred to this enzyme here, and then these electrons from this enzyme are taken to Photosystem I. So remember, Photosystem I still had that antenna complex, but it's this reaction center we want to think about. And just like over here, it lost those electrons, so you have to restore those electrons. And so it restores those electrons, as I was hinting to, by this enzyme donating the electrons to these special pair of chlorophyll molecules here, restoring the electrons so that Photosystem I can now move forward and continue. Again, if this didn't happen, if this enzyme that's moving these electrons over here fails, then Photosystem I fails as well, and you won't make the NADPH that is necessary to make in Photosystem I. Okay, well, I think that sums up everything we need to know from the light capturing reactions, the first part of photosynthesis. So it's an appropriate place to end this first podcast. But let's remember what we learned about the light capturing reactions. We learned that the photons from the sun excite those electrons in the chlorophylls of those photosystems. By doing so, ATP and NADPH are produced that can now be used in the Calvin cycle. We also just talked about how water is used to generate oxygen, but the main purpose for the plant doing this is to regenerate those electrons in the special pair of chlorophylls in the reaction center. In the next podcast, we're going to pick up right where we left off here with the Calvin cycle.